No, I mean, we can move this. We can move this forward, so this is a little easier. There are some people, I guess, watching on the live stream, so keep that in mind.
We working? Yeah? Do you want to close that door? All set? Do you know what? I'll take the hand. Okay. There we go. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in the room and on the stream. We are very excited to have a great panel with us here today, who I'll introduce you to shortly. My name is Sue Duke, and I head up Global Public Policy for LinkedIn. And at LinkedIn, a huge part of the work that we're doing and the reason that we're here is we're looking at the insights and data that are coming from membership. Do you know? Is that better? Yeah. At our membership of over 875 million. Some tech issues. It's not a metaphor. It's okay. Meta's saving the day as usual. Our membership of over 875 million members around the world to try and understand what's happening out there in this transition to green. How are workers and where are workers adopting green skills? Where are they applying them? And what are the gaps between where we are now and where we need to get to? This is Implementation COP. And we feel very strongly that implementation will happen because people make it happen. And it is crucially important that people have the right skills in the right jobs at the right time if we are going to move forward and drive that implementation that we all know needs to happen. We are extremely fortunate to have a panel of true experts with us today who spend a ton of time thinking about that roadmap to our 2030 and 2050 climates, what's in those roadmaps and what isn't, and what are the key changes we need to see happen over the course of COP27 here in Sharm el-Sheikh, but also beyond. And I couldn't be more excited to hear from them, get their insights and reflections about where they think we are now and where it is that we need to go. So I am going to introduce everybody very quickly. We have Noreen Kennedy, who's Senior Vice President of Policy and Global Strategies at the U.S. Council of International Business. David Waskow, who's Director of International Climate Initiatives at the World Research Institute. James Graybert, who's Director of Mitigation at UNFCCC. And Mette Lund, who is the Private Sector Engagement Lead for the Green Jobs Programme at the ILO. So, Noreen, I am going to start with you. Noreen, would you believe, is currently at her 27th COP. I said that to her and she said, that's right, and counting. So Noreen obviously is probably the most experienced person in the building in terms of understanding where we've come from, the progress we've made, the progress we haven't, the mechanics of of how this happens, how we turn that progress and move it forward. So I'd love to kick off, Noreen, with your reflections on when you look back on what you've seen. How do you feel we're doing? How far have we come? And what are the key changes you think we still need to see come through?
Thanks for that great introduction. Hi, everyone. Maybe just to start, I'll say a little bit about my organization, because I think it's important to situate what we do in order to understand the perspective and the reflections I'm going to offer. So just to say that the U.S. Council for International Business is based in New York. We're entirely focused on the international arena. We don't do any lobbying. We represent our member companies, one of which is LinkedIn, in all kinds of UN institutions, including this one, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we have been active since 1993, so even in the pre-COP days. And when we first started working in the climate change space, one of my members, very visionary, said, you know, this is going to become a treaty about everything. And lo and behold, 27 years later, I think we can safely say that we're getting very close to that because of the nature of the issue and how important it is, and in how many ways that it touches people's lives, touches the business community, touches society. So in terms of this question about skills, it's a relatively new point. I think the issues of skills and jobs and education started to come in, at least in my assessment, through the discussion of just transition, which made its way into the Paris Agreement. And kudos to, well, ILO, kudos to the trade union representatives to really bring this subject to the table. And I think, full disclosure, we represent U.S. employers in the ILO. We're part of IOE, the International Organization of Employers, but we were a little late to the game. I mean, certainly active in Geneva, but not active enough on this subject matter at the beginning during the Paris days. There was also a fair amount of discussion around, I'm going to geek out a little bit here, on response measures as well. And so there's been also that track informing what is now, even though we're late to the game, we're showing up in a big way, this focus on skills and jobs as essential to just transition and as essential to the all hands on deck that we know is needed, going back to the points that you made. Let me say a little bit about nationally determined contributions, which was a real innovation in the Paris Agreement. And I think WRI gets a lot of credit here for shining some bright lights on how to create a quality nationally determined contribution. But certainly one of the points that we were making, which I think was similarly brought up by WRI, was that in addition to talking about what the governments are going to do, what kinds of pledges they're going to make, they needed to be developed and still need to be updated in consultation with different important societal partners, different non-governmental entities, the workers, of course, and business and employers. So I think that's still out there as a real potential, that the nationally determined contributions don't yet adequately reflect, don't adequately include skills and jobs, the kind of information that comes through LinkedIn and all the other really great sources of data out there would be invaluable and should definitely be reflected. I mean, we're always talking about how we need more ambition and more implementation, and yet we don't give, I think, enough attention either at the national level or here in the UN space to how we can really reflect both what's already out there and happening, so that is somehow invisible to the decision makers, but also where we have gaps, where if we deployed resources, where if we placed more attention on training and education, we could actually make some real progress and we could supplement what's happening through government action. So I don't know if I've gone on for too long, but those are just some kind of highlights in terms of how this issue has developed, the opportunity that we have hopefully in the construct of the UN Framework Convention and the nationally determined contributions, where I think there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot more sort of climbing the learning curve in bringing forward important information, including about skills and jobs. So I'll leave it there.
That's great, Noreen. Thank you so much. And James, I might turn to you because you are obviously deep in the weeds of the NDCs and examining what how they're shaping up, what's in them and what's not. And as Noreen says, that focus on jobs and skills is a relatively recent one. I know that the most recent comprehensive UN study of those NDCs shows that about 60% of them at least mention jobs and skills, but not much more. About 40% do a little bit more in terms of a plan, and fully 20% don't mention them at all. So as somebody who's looking and examining NDCs, trying to figure out how do we make this mechanism work the way Noreen has set out we know they can. How are you feeling right now? What is the progress that you're seeing, and what is it that you're looking to see throughout the 2 weeks of COP in terms of them evolving and improving, particularly to address this key skills and jobs point?
Okay, well, let me first of all let me thank you for having me here today, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Sue. Thank you to LinkedIn for having us. Um, Let me start by saying, well, what we've collectively said we're going to do is we're going to, and most recently, is we're going to make sure we manage the gap in those plans
Yep.
to what is really needed to lower the temperatures. But the ambition that we're talking about is not just about data; it's about people and
Yes.
jobs and society, and that's where this topic comes into play. And we've been working in the recent years, with parties and the delegates, and trying to get this more and more on the agenda, and particularly in terms of the expectations of what should be in those NDCs.
Yeah.
So I would like to say, us as well as many of the advocates, including those of you here with me today, have been somewhat successful. We are seeing these things being addressed or referred to in the NDCs, as you referred to in the most recent. Where we did see, I think it was 67% is the number of the NDCs, where we had an expression of social or economic consequences of the actions that are being taken, directly or indirectly. Um, Impact on the workforce was the most prominent message we're seeing in the NDCs. But what stood out, you were asking what particularly I find interesting. What stood out were the references to just transition mechanisms and just transition funds. This is interesting because it takes a holistic approach to things in a manner that you're covering, say, hopefully, the broader social economic context. Another thing that we saw, this goes to Noreen's point, was uh, an effort to start thinking about the quantitative assessment needed, the tools, the methodologies, how to do this. So that's there in some of the NDCs. So it was great to see that. But then this brings me to the barriers. What we heard them saying about why it's not easy, and specifically what we notice is there's a lot of talk about job creation, or the jobs that are going to be coming because of the green transition, but not enough talk about the existing jobs and what is the training, what is the skill reset, how is that happening, and not enough of that is coming forward in terms of how does the plan address that, in addition to how the plan addresses job creation, future jobs being aligned. And then the second, be short here, the second barrier that we would, I would say, was prevalent is the data. Um, Even those countries who want to talk about what are the methodologies and tools we need to do this assessment, um, access to data or lack of data, knowledge about the data, perhaps what Noreen was referring to, is we need to do better at making sure parties understand there is information available, and that data has to be used in order to develop the best plans that are best for society, and in particular, in this case, for green jobs, both in terms of those creating the right jobs, but also moving people from the existing jobs. I'll stop there and maybe come back later.
That's super, and it really resonates with what we see in our data, which is that yes, we see a huge surge in terms of these core green jobs that we hear so much about, but actually the vast majority of green skills are being used in traditional roles. So roles that people don't often think of as green, like fleet manager, data scientist, etc., but that we do indeed need being done in a more sustainable way. If, to your point, if we're going to get there, it has to be about existing workers as well as new workers, about existing jobs as well as new jobs. And David, I might turn to you as somebody who's looking very deeply at NDCs. Are you? We're hearing a mix of optimism and concern from James. Are you in a similar mood, having worked on this for quite a while now and coming into the start of COP?
I think that there's enormous potential now. That's what we're seeing. And for example, building on what James said about the what's in the NDCs, we did a scan to see how many of the NDCs talked about just transition, which is sort of overlapping with the workforce set of issues that James mentioned. And there are 32 NDCs, including one from the EU, that touch on just transition explicitly in some fashion. That's a dramatic increase. He wants me closer to the mic. That's a dramatic increase. In 2015, with the original NDCs, there was a single NDC that mentioned just transition, South Africa's. And so we've seen a real shift in terms of the number of countries that are both recognizing the need to address this and also have an interest and a stated interest in doing so. Now, where there are gaps that need to be addressed going forward, first, implementation is critical. And some of these NDCs are more detailed than others in their discussion of just transition. I think for many of the countries, whether and how the NDC's emphasis on just transition is put into practice in their national policies is still a very open question. So the seeds are there. The question now is, how do we grow them? Second thing I just quickly wanted to mention is that when thinking about skills and training and so forth, it's critical not to think just in sort of a macro sense. And there are a number of studies out there that look at, for particular countries and globally, the ILO has done some of these, for example, what the growth in green jobs is compared to the jobs that will be lost as you shift away from a fossil economy. We've done some work, sort of a meta study, looking at the multiplier effects, essentially, of jobs. Depending on different policies, you get 1.5 times more jobs with solar PV than you do with fossil fuels. Similarly, mass transit gives you 1.5 times more jobs. Investments in mass transit, I should be clear, gives you 1.5 times more jobs than road building does. So that's great. It's at a macro level, though. And often, especially with just transition questions, one needs to look at a more micro level, at specific communities where there may be job loss, and also particular parts of the population where there may be job loss, and really attuning the way in which we think about skills and training to those very specific contexts. And of course, there's some jobs that are going to be that can, with transferable skills, that can move into the green economy. But there are also some, and certainly some geographies where that's not necessarily the case. So we have to figure out also, what are the new kinds of jobs that aren't just green economy jobs into which these workers can move, and how do you diversify economies in those communities in ways that can provide those jobs? So I'll leave it there.
That's great. And when you, I think rightly say, and Noreen, I know you mentioned this as well, obviously we need the data, but we're also going to need the partnerships. Do you feel, Noreen, I know you were saying that you're really starting to feel like the right parties are around the table and the motivation is there. Is that true, David? Are you seeing that as well, that business, civil society, workers, do you, to your point about how do we get from roadmaps to actual implementation and action, that will take people and coalitions. Do you see progress there?
I think that process, I mean, it depends where, first of all, right? So I think in some places, and the ILO has really done a lot of work to start building the kinds of thinking and capacity that are needed on the ground in countries. So there's a set of countries where they've begun that process, but I think there's still a number of countries where that hasn't begun in a significant way, and where it's going to be critical. And just to give an example, I think with South Africa has really been a leader in articulating what's needed for a just transition. The fact that they are the first country that there is a just energy transition partnership with is not an accident. There may be some questions about how the just transition actually fits into that partnership. But setting that aside, South Africa has been in a leadership role. By contrast, some of the other countries that are sort of next up on the list of just energy transition partnerships, such as Indonesia and India, have not really figured out how to engage around just transition work, and what are the ways that skills can be transferred, what's the retraining that needs to happen, etc. And in the context of India in particular, we've looked at who would be able to move into those new jobs. And it's often a very specific slice of the population. And so there's a number of people who might not be able to, and who really need specific attention as part of that shift.
Yeah. And Noreen, that's, I see you nodding, that's similar to your experience.
I think that's part of the experience. I think part of the experience too is that within the UN Framework Convention, the ability to work with non-state actors has been a very slow process, a very incremental process, one which has not always moved as quickly as it should, and certainly with respect to the NDCs, you know, once you have at the national level a conversation going or a partnership going, as David just described, with different societal partners, then that might suggest that that conversation and that representation would also be present here.
Yeah.
And yet, that's not always the case either. I mean, we've definitely seen more and more involvement of different important constituencies, including employers, including workers, and more opportunities to have dialogue. But I still think we're a ways off from mainstreaming and really integrating the experience and the data in a way that will then lead to the appropriate decision making and the deployment of resources. So we've made some good steps in different national settings, as David said, but I think we still need to make more progress in this UN Framework Convention setting where all of it converges, hopefully, and we make decisions to move ahead. Thank you.
And Meta, one thing I know that you and the ILO are very focused on is exactly that availability and deployment of resources, and particularly when it comes to less wealthy countries. And obviously, one of the key areas of debate throughout COP is going to be that wealthy countries and less wealthy countries, and how can we all move forward, and what does the partnership need to look like. Love to hear from you about not a small area, not an uncomplicated area, but your experience there, and again, particularly as it relates to jobs and skills, because as both Noreen and David have said, that can be a very different picture depending on what country we're looking at, what sector we're looking at, what demographic we're looking at. So huge challenges there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that, if I just can take one moment to
Please.
maybe comment a little bit to some things that you were saying here. First of all, James, you said that what we see in the NDCs is that there's an increasingly focus on the jobs potential, the economic potential of the green transition, but to a smaller degree about the existing workforce. And I think this is quite interesting and a huge blind spot, because when we look at the green transition, we know that, yes, there is a positive narrative. We will create more green jobs than in a, for example, a fossil fuel future. But we also know that the majority of the transition in the labor market will be jobs that are either substituted or transformed. So what will actually happen is there will be a few jobs lost, more jobs gained, but the most transition, the biggest change in the labor market that will happen is in the middle of the existing jobs that will be transitioning. So this is a huge gap and a big barrier. And I think the reason why we talked a little bit about the barriers, why the NDCs are, skills development is being included now in the NDCs to a larger degree, and that has perhaps been lacking behind a little bit. Well, I think an obvious answer is that the line ministries that need to be involved in this are multiple. So it's everything from education. Education split. I'm gonna lean over here. So education can also be split into several ministries, right? Higher education, lower ed, etc. Already there, complication. Then you have the labor ministries. Then you have the ministries of industry. Then, of course, you have, perhaps in some countries, climate change ministries or environment ministries, etc. So I think the reason why the NDCs are only now starting to incorporate the social dimension of climate change is simply because until now there's been too little policy coherence about it on this topic. So that leads me to your question, right? What can we do in this area? And in the ILO, of course, we support our constituents and governments, workers, and employers on the just transition agenda, but also on skills development and the whole green transition in general. And what we've been doing very recently has, and I think that's maybe a little bit interesting in this context, has actually been supporting quite a lot of South-South cooperation. So, for example, we recently worked with the BRICS group, on the BRICS group on evaluating their NDCs and how they have been incorporated the social dimension of climate change. And what we see there is that some of them, there's a big difference. There's a big difference even within this group of 5 countries. So South Africa is very often highlighted. They have an excellent inclusion of just transition and all the dimension of um, the social dimension to climate change. But also, for example, China, that includes everything from the skilling and reskilling of workers, but also higher education and actually university cooperations with other developing countries. So I think that there are some pretty good examples of developing countries learning from each other and inspiring each other and also building network across. And especially, for example, these partnerships and focuses not only on higher education, but also the other levels, because we know that the majority of the jobs will be middle skilled types of jobs. So I think that would at least be an example that I wanted to highlight, this South-South cooperation that, for example, happens in BRICS and other country groups.
That's great. And James, I might turn to you as well to get your experience, particularly on that, the partnership and the collaboration between wealthy and less wealthy countries, and again, your level of optimism around the progress that we're seeing there.
Well, I think it comes down to the capacity. One thing is the capacity of countries to be able to do some of the things you were just referring to in terms of being all of society and all of government approach. Because what we've seen is an evolution in the NDCs to some extent, and through our work and work with, for example, NDC partnership, trying to ensure broader stakeholder um, to localize the issues, to use the community approaches in many governments, in many countries, to be able to have the discussions, to have the increase in education around these issues because of the traditions and the way they do things. But it's a long way from where it needs to be. So that's what we've seen, is an attention to that now is being turned, but we need to implement it, and that's where I believe you will find the divide between, say, the middle income or emerging economies and those who really struggle in terms of to be able to do a thorough job, not so much in producing an NDC, and excuse me for saying, I mean, it's just a product. It's about implementing the policies and making the change in society that addresses the needs of the communities and the people and the workers. And ultimately, that's why we're doing all this. Of course, we have these requirements. We need the NDCs. We need the transparency. We need to see what we're doing, of course. But I do want to bring us back to it's the actual things, the actions, and the policies that is so important. And so anything we can do to help those countries, I think we would then see less of a divide. But we do see the divide in terms of those that are wealthier and can have these discussions. And the you mentioned, David, the just energy transition partnerships is an example. Of course, they're not the tools for all economies. They are tools for certain economies, and but even there, we're not seeing, as you pointed out, the issue of just transition really being everywhere. So it comes down to the collaboration and cooperation internationally. It has to address this. We talk about in our process the multilateral process. It's all about cooperation after Paris. Well, this has to be embraced by the community in terms of helping countries get to where they need to be, and this has to be at the forefront, I would say, in terms of it's not about just the policies. It's not even the impacts of the policies, which we at least managed to discuss in our process, but it's even more than that, and that's what we all need to do to help move the process. I would say.
And to Meta's point, it's always been a very disparate set of stakeholders, even at government level, right? That it's not just green skills and impact on green work. It sits in different ministries. That's been the case with skills and jobs, split across many different ministries and across many different partners on the ground. And one thing is to try and move all of those different constituents in a similar direction. Do you have an example, James, where you see that happening, where you feel, in a less developed country, where you've started to see at least the ship turn? Because often you do have to get a ship of state and business and civil society moving in at least in the same direction, to your point, if we're going to actually see some rubber hit the ground road here. Do you have an example of where...
I wouldn't want to name particular countries, but we have seen a number of the developing countries in their most recent updated NDCs where we're seeing what seems to be a more holistic approach and a coherence in terms of the policies and why they have them, and an understanding of the impact of those policies. And what seems to be behind it is taking the time to go through phases of understanding, okay, their own social economic context, involving the right ministries, trying to, again, there's a gap, I believe, still, involve the relevant stakeholders and talk that through in dialogues, in the discussions and committees, however it's done in different countries is different, and arrive at a product that's been thoroughly reviewed and owned by the parts of the economy and society. And those that have, it seems to me, that have made those efforts and done some of that have had more, let's say, thorough NDCs or policies in terms of and links with the broader issues such as sustainable development and just transition.
Noreen?
I mean, but okay.
Right now?
All right, now we're. Oh, sorry. I mean, I know in some of the previous COPs in recent memory, here we go again. We have had examples where employers groups have really worked together. I remember in Marrakesh, the local employers federation launched an initiative called Marrakesh Business Action for Environment, and what that concerned was working with other employers federations in Africa, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, to basically cooperatively capacity build one another, and with the Moroccan government being very supportive, and this really creating a momentum that continues to this day. So that's one example. I remember before the Peruvian COP, the Peruvian host country, Peru as the host country, invited different constituencies to meet with their local constituencies and talk with them about how to approach the different issues that were on the table. And certainly we got an earful, those of us who went from the private sector, from Peruvian both employers and business organizations, talking about what they saw as challenges of transition. They didn't call it just transition, but just the transition that had to occur, and also particular challenges in Peru around informality. In other words, not just the formal economy that we were meeting with, but those that were outside the regulatory space, but which somehow have to be brought in. And then same story about job creation, green skills, etc. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for the host country to take advantage of and mobilize and create these moments of cooperation. And certainly here in Egypt, next year in Dubai, I think we could still follow some interesting opportunities.
That's great. Thank you, Noreen. David, I might pass the same to you. I know you mentioned the South Africa example, but again, from the industry perspective, are key lessons you're seeing that, again, I hear everybody loud and clear that it gets, once you start getting on the ground, it gets very specific and very local. But are there key trends or key learnings that you're starting to see emerge? And again, thinking about implementation, thinking about progress, key things you'd like to see, and particularly like to see over the course of this 2 weeks in terms of agreement and then moving on into implementation.
Yeah, so echoing a lot of what Noreen said, I think one of the most important aspects of addressing jobs issues, just transition issues, and skills and training issues is to have multi-stakeholder consultation processes. And we've seen South Africa is an excellent example where the Just Transition Framework, which is separate from the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and was developed, the framework was developed by the Presidential Climate Commission, um, really brings together the insights and experiences of many aspects of the South African economy. And the Climate Commission there went out to everyone. They really, geographically, they went to all regions of the country. They met with every constituency and really tried to foster a dialogue. And I think the ILO, in many ways, is a model for the kind of multi-stakeholder engagement. And I think it's one reason the ILO has been able to be at the forefront, in fact, of these kind of issues, because it brings together governments, labor, and business. And that, so, that kind of process is really an underpinning. And I think we, in fact, are not going to be able to address the job transitions, the new jobs that are coming, figure out for existing workers where they can have jobs, et cetera, without that kind of multi-stakeholder process.
Meta, would you like to jump in your experience, given the fantastic work that the ILO has and continues to do, and obviously the Pact for Jobs being a great example of this effort to bring multiple parties and stakeholders and constituents together to exactly what David is talking about?
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind words, I guess. No, for sure. I think that the social dialogue as we have it in the ILO, but also broader multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue is really important, because I think the reason why the social dimension has been forgotten of climate in the climate change dialogue for so long was because the discussion was too narrow. And I don't point the fingers at anyone, because I mean, when you think about a green future, you very automatically imagine a green future that is healthy and clean for everyone and inclusive. And you imagine a green future as being something that is going to benefit all. But the problem is that that's not going to happen automatically, right? And that's why it's so great that we now have a language around just transition on this topic. And that really came out of the social dialogue process, and by including more stakeholders in the dialogue. I think the same goes for youth. I think when we're a place like here, where there are quite a lot of representatives from disadvantaged groups. It can be women's groups, it can be youth groups, it can be the indigenous peoples, etc. This representation is really important when we have these kind of discussions, because we will automatically have blind spots and we will have our expertise in areas of knowledge. And I think that these processes, these side events like here, and the discussion in general is really important. The last thing I maybe wanted to say is that it is, it is excluding in the sense that, of course, it requires some kind of prior knowledge and understanding. I don't know if anyone ever read the Just Transition Guidelines, but it's not a page turner, right? It's not written in the most accessible language, and I mean, don't get me started on the NDCs. So, so I would say that we're getting better at communicating about the challenges that we face, and that also makes people that are not necessarily at COP or that are not necessarily following the climate change agenda on a daily basis also understand the challenges and the complexity of it.
That's great, Meta. Thank you. And Noreen and myself were speaking just before the panel about this issue precisely, which is this communication one as well, right? And that, as you say, it has been quite a narrow conversation for a very long time. But even as it broadens out, there's still a lot of complexity. It can be difficult to access. It can be difficult to feel like that's a conversation for you or for your constituents or for your country. Noreen, I know you have some thoughts on this in terms of an area where you'd like to see us improve. Anything to share?
Yeah, thanks.
Oh.
We have an abundance of mics here. So definitely, I think the communication challenge is front and center, especially in the very fraught political atmosphere that the United Nations faces, that many of the important countries are facing right now. And I think in the business community, we're getting better and better about understanding and communicating back out to customers, to investors, to the people that work with us and for us, why we're doing those things and how there will be a return on the investment. And I think that's a challenge still for many of the governments. How do you communicate the benefit for the return on effort and investment and time spent? So that's one point. I think a second point is to steal a little bit of a line from Field of Dreams, you know, if you build it, they will come. I think we've seen time and again in the UN Framework Convention that, of course, stakeholders are here and we all have different objectives in being here and we try to inform the process in all kinds of ways. But if there was a recognized place for us, let's say in the global stock take, right? We're going through, now I'm geeking out again, we're going through the global stock take, which is a kind of a consideration of where we've gotten to, what's in the NDCs, what do we need to do more of. I mean, if there was a way to bring in these questions that we've been talking about and this information that is coming through companies, especially from LinkedIn, but other companies too, and that the private sector has, and that organizations like WRI has, I mean, wouldn't that enrich the discussion and give us a much more complete basis on which to think about what we need to do next and where we needed to put the resources? So I definitely think that as we talk about this idea of inclusive multilateralism, which the previous executive secretary, Patricia Espinosa, was a big champion for, we have to think about that in terms of bringing the other constituencies and societal partners into the room, into the table, and asking us for information and data which we can offer, and thanks to you, we can offer even more, and make that the basis of then an agreement for what needs to happen, and that will make it much more likely that the private sector will not just show up, but will do more. So that's my tirade on this subject. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. James, I might turn to you briefly as well on the communications challenge. It certainly does feel like a more inclusive conversation. But one thing we've certainly noticed in our own work is, you know, Meta, you mentioned young people, super engaged, could not be more engaged. Anything to do with green or sustainability on the platform, like engagement is off the charts, particularly with that demographic. I think the challenge comes to your earlier point around what do I do? Where do I go? What job can I do? What training can I get, etc. And again, that's a communications challenge. It's a data challenge, as well as other pieces. But that communication piece does seem to be really, really critical.
Well, from our side, as the UNFCCC side, I do completely agree. We need to do even more in terms of being able to communicate the issue in a way that's understood. I mean, you know, in DC, you know, we need to talk about what it is we're talking about. We're talking about socioeconomic transition and 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 better livelihood. Um, and I think, you know, and I I'm very happy that climate change gets all the attention it gets, and that we are making enormous progress in recent years. I joined a half 6 months after the first COP, so I've also been around quite a while and seen some wonderful things happen. But we do have a framework, and it's not a replacement for just transition. But if we would also do better at understanding what it means really to implement all the SDGs, if you did that, you probably have tackled the majority of this issue. If we
Yep.
really did it thoroughly, and that's why it's important in our processes, particularly with respect to climate change, and preparing national plans and long term strategies, is make sure we give due consideration to the SDGs and seriously address them. Because if you do that, you are addressing. I'm talking beyond the jobs and skills, the broader just transition. You are addressing it broadly. It may not be perfect, but and that exists, and we should use those tools because that's something I think is broader, it's understood more, perhaps in some of the peculiarities and acronyms of climate change.
Yeah, and Matt, I know this greener picture, this more hopeful picture, is one that the ILO has been keen to paint as well. So I'm not surprised you want to jump in there.
Yes, exactly. That's what I wanted to say. Is that I think something that I maybe just want to. I don't know if we're getting to the end, but what I wanted to make sure to say at least is that I think that first of all, the transition will happen. We are encouraging everyone to do plan well in advance because is how we will be able to maximize the benefits and minimize the harm from the transition, so that we can be smart about it. But when we look specifically on skills, I also want to say that actually, while there is, let's take for example the circular economy for a second. So we have some data in the ILO that shows that if we successfully transition to circular economy, we will create 78 million jobs worldwide. Wow, so much. Excellent, 78 million, that's so much. Yes, but we'll also lose 71 million jobs. So the net increase is not very high, but what is really important, and this just shows what kind of shock a green transition can be, is that those 71 million jobs, well, I mean, there's a plus on the balance sheet of 7 million, right? So those 71 million jobs that will be lost, what are we going to do about them? How are we going to make sure that they are absorbed into those 78 million jobs that are newly created? And that is where these new skills, the reskilling, of course, skilling of young people, but also to a large degree skilling of the existing workforce. And what we also see in the ILO is that actually the good thing here and the positive narrative is that there are a lot of skills that we already have that are transferable. And to a large degree, it's not necessarily the technical skills that will be needed. And I know this is something that LinkedIn is working a lot on as well. But it is actually to a large degree soft skills, transferable skills such as sales or cooperation or program management or, well, IT, which can be both a hard skill and a soft skill. So I think what I wanted to just make sure to say is that, yes, the transition is complex. Yes, we talked about how it's in silos, across different line ministries, etc. But there are also some simpler positive perspectives, such as, for example, we already know a lot. We're already an increasingly more talented workforce. We're increasingly more knowledgeable group of people here on planet. And, we can transition them if we do it in a proper and a well thought way.
Well, on that optimistic and inspirational note, we are going to do a switch. So I'm going to say thank you to Meta and James and David and Noreen for a great discussion. And I'm going to welcome up Morton. Sorry.
I guess this is